You know how your phone can just instantly pull up every single picture of your dog? It feels like magic, right? But for a computer, that's actually one of the hardest things you could ask it to do. Today, we're diving into the tech that made it all possible. Convolutional neural networks, or CNNs, the breakthrough that finally taught machines how to see.
I mean, think about it. For you and me, it's obvious. We see fur, we see whiskers, those pointy ears, and our brain just knows that's a cat. But for a computer, it's a completely different universe. To get how a machine sees, you kind of have to throw out everything you think you know about vision. And that right there is the heart of the whole challenge. A computer has zero concept of fur or ears. It doesn't even know what a picture is. All it gets is a gigantic grid of numbers. An image to a machine is just a wall of raw data. So every single pixel in a color photo is just 3 numbers to a machine. One for how much red, one for green, and one for blue. A photograph of a person basically becomes 3 massive spreadsheets of numbers all stacked up. The face, the colors, the emotion, all of it just disappears into this sea of numbers. So, how in the world do you bridge that gap? How do you teach a machine to find a cat hiding inside a giant matrix of numbers? Well, the solution that computer scientists came up with is seriously elegant, and it's actually inspired by how our own brains work. And that brings us to the star of the show, the Convolutional Neural Network, or CNN. The real genius of a CNN is that it doesn't try to understand the whole picture all at once. Nope. Instead, it mimics our vision by learning to see in layers, starting with the simplest, most basic parts of an image. And it does this using a special tool called a convolution kernel. Okay, so think of a kernel like a tiny, specialized magnifying glass. Each one is designed to find just one specific thing. So you might have one that's an expert at finding vertical lines. Another one is an expert at spotting a particular shade of blue. A third one just looks for sharp corners. The network then takes thousands of these little detectors and slides them over every single pixel of the image. And here's what that looks like in action. Let's take our original image and slide a kernel that only looks for horizontal edges across it. What we get out is something called a feature map. It's like a brand new image where the only things that light up are the exact spots where that kernel found a horizontal line. Everywhere else is dark. And this is the crucial part. The network does this with hundreds of different kernels all at the same time. So it generates hundreds of these feature maps simultaneously. One map for horizontal edges, another for vertical ones, another for 45-degree angles, you name it. It's basically building this rich, detailed vocabulary of all the simple shapes in the image. And as researcher Jian-Sin Wu points out, this is where the real power kicks in. These simple features, the lines, the curves, the colors, they become the building blocks for much bigger ideas. The network starts to learn that an eye is just a specific combination of circles and curves, and a nose is a different combination of lines and shadows. Okay, so now the network has created all these feature maps. But that's a ton of information, and honestly, not all of it is useful. The next step is to intelligently filter all this down and just keep the important stuff. The first tool for this is a really simple but brilliant little function called ReLU. You can just think of it as an on-off switch. If a kernel found a strong match for its pattern, the value on the feature map is positive, so ReLU keeps it on. But if there was no match, the value is negative or 0, so ReLU just switches it off, sets it to 0. It's a simple way of telling the network, hey, only pay attention to the features we actually found. Now, this simple on-off switch was a total game changer. It solved this huge problem called the vanishing gradient. See, in older networks, as information passed through more and more layers, the signal would get weaker and weaker, kind of like an echo fading away until it just vanished. The network couldn't learn. But ReLU keeps that signal strong, which lets us build these massive networks that are hundreds of layers deep and can learn incredibly complex stuff. All right, so this brings us to something that at first glance seems like a complete contradiction. Sometimes we'll add extra pixels of padding around an image specifically to keep our feature maps from shrinking. But then, in the very next step, we use a process called pooling to deliberately shrink them. So, what is going on here? So first, let's just be clear on padding. Sometimes we use valid padding, which means no padding at all, and the output gets a little smaller. But often we use same padding, where we add a border of zeros around the image. The whole point is to make sure the output feature map is the exact same size as the input. This is really important for preserving information, especially from the pixels right at the edges. So that just makes the question even weirder. Why go to all that trouble just to shrink it right after? The answer is something called max pooling. And it's not a dumb shrink, it's a smart one. Here's what it does. The network looks at a small window of the feature map, say a 2x2 square of pixels, and it finds the single brightest pixel in that square. It keeps that one, the strongest signal, and just throws the other three away.
And this is why it's so powerful. For one, it drastically cuts down on the amount of data, which makes the whole thing run way faster. But it does it intelligently by keeping only the most important piece of information from each little neighborhood, the strongest signal for each feature. It also creates this really cool property called translation invariance. Basically, it helps the network care less about the exact pixel location of a feature and more about the fact that the feature, like an eye, is just present somewhere in that general area.
Okay, so we've got our building blocks. Convolutions find the features, ReLU filters them, and pooling summarizes them. But that leaves the biggest question of all. How does the network know which features to even look for in the first place? This right here is the most amazing part of the whole process.
So here's the secret sauce. Nobody ever sits down and programs a kernel to find cat whiskers. It's not like that at all. The network actually starts out with a bunch of completely random, totally useless kernels. It has to figure out what's important entirely on its own by making millions and millions of mistakes.
It all happens in this constant learning loop. First, the network looks at an image and makes a guess, a totally wild guess at the beginning. Then, it compares its guess to the right answer and calculates how wrong it was. That's the loss. Now, here comes the magic, a process called backpropagation. The network sends that error signal backward through every single layer, figuring out which kernels were most responsible for the mistake. And then it just slightly tweaks all of those kernels so they'll be a tiny bit less wrong next time.
And then it does it again, and again, and again. Not just a few times. We're talking millions of times across thousands and thousands of labeled images. With every single pass through this loop, those random, useless kernels get a little bit smarter, a little more dialed in, until they eventually become expert feature detectors. What you end up with is this beautiful hierarchy of knowledge. The very first layers learn to see super simple things like edges and colors. Then the middle layers learn to combine those edges and colors into more complex textures and patterns, like fur or an eye. And finally, the top layers learn how to assemble all those parts into a complete concept, like cat. And that is why this all matters. This powerful, layered way of learning is the engine that's driving so much of the incredible technology we see today. We're talking about self-driving cars, facial recognition, and even medical systems that can spot signs of cancer in scans more accurately than a human doctor. So, in the end, CNNs have completely changed how machines perceive our world. By teaching them to see not as a single action, but as a hierarchy of patterns, from a simple line all the way up to a complex idea, we've really, in a way, given them the gift of sight. The only question left is, now that they can see, what will we teach them to understand next?